All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 26, Section 3, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So we got a huge map here to kind of help us figure out where everything is going on. Usually when we refer to Southeast Asia, we're sort of talking about the region, sort of, we'll say, kind of like right in here, sort of, right? Especially all these islands here. All right, so this is Southeast Asia. Sometimes you'll hear India being referred to as South Asia. Japan and China is typically referred to as East Asia, right? China, Japan, Korea. Central Asia refers typically to Mongolia, and if you're feeling extra spicy, sometimes the Middle East is referred to as Southwest Asia. So we're going to be focusing on this area right in here, and somewhat similar to the continent of Africa, there's a lot of different imperial powers at play there. So in terms of some of the areas in Southeast Asia and which countries colonized them, for Java, or what is the country of Indonesia, this remained a Dutch colony. So we're referring to, these islands here, Java, right, being this island here, but also some of these islands here were maintained Dutch control there, whereas most other territories were either taken over by the British. The British exercised their control in Southeast Asia by taking over important cities, sometimes referred to as the Strait Settlements, Malacca and Singapore, in addition to Burma. So if we mark British in red, we know that the British, of course, last section, talked about British India, which controlled all these areas. But they exerted their control into Burma, which is located right here, right? This is Burma. And then the Strait cities is referring to the Straits of Malacca. And that, of course, is this waterway way right here. And we actually talked about in a previous chapter why this waterway is important, because it's the fastest way to get from India to China, Korea, and Japan. So, for example, if a ship is going, to Japan, it has to go through this little strait of water here and get around to this area. That's a lot quicker than having to go around all these islands. So, very, very important strategically. Singapore and Malacca, both on the Malaysian peninsula there, that is British. And again, it looks like the British carved off some territory in this particular region as well. So again, strait settlements, the cities of Malacca. Malacca would be located like somewhere right here. Singapore located right in that particular area. Interestingly enough, when it came to the country of Thailand, Thailand remained independent. Maybe we'll go ahead and let's use red to denote British, right? So this was British territory. Thailand independent, which was, again, one of the rare instances of a nation retaining its independence during the era of imperialism. You could probably add that with like Ethiopia, that was able to stay out of imperial control. And then Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. This area, where are we? Right in here. That essentially is what the French took control of. So in a lot of these different areas, a lot of different countries that are involved. Not on this map, but further south and to the east include Australia and New Zealand. In both of those areas, the British colonized. Same with New Zealand. Australia initially was a colony for people who had been put in prison, right? A penal colony, so convicts were resettled in Australia. That's how some of the first British settlers arrived there. The British settlers came into contact with the native population, the Aborigines. The Aborigines is the native Australian population. And in fact, in Australia, we don't have a map, but it was an island that remained isolated, much like the New World did before Columbus. So no diseases, no spread of information and technology. The Aborigines lived a relatively isolated life. And so when the first British settlers arrived with technologies like weapons, but maybe more importantly with diseases, it proved to be devastating. And a lot of the Aborigines population was displaced by the British. Similarly, in New Zealand, British also began to settle there. The native population, the Maori, so this is the native population, was similarly displaced. But in both of these countries, New Zealand and Australia, as more representative governments were created, it's been kind of a struggle and an effort to try to incorporate indigenous groups into the larger predominant British governments in those particular areas. Australia and New Zealand maintain a position sort of similar to Canada, sort of similar to South Africa, in that they are part of the British Commonwealth, but do have some sort of semblance of self-government. So no real revolution was necessary like you saw in the British colonies of North America, but they're very closely tied to Great Britain, to Canada, and to South Africa. Meanwhile, in areas like the Philippines and Hawaii, at least on this map, let's see, what do we want? We'll put the United States in green. The Philippines are these islands right here, right? So that is where the United States is exercising its presence. The United States is one of these, what we might call late imperial powers. They are unique in that they are the only imperial power in the Western Hemisphere, in the New World, North or South America. They were one of the countries that benefited greatly from industrial technology and also a semblance of nationalism. So much like the British and the French and the Germans all wanted to claim empires of their own, so too does America. What makes them a little bit late to the table, you might say, is the American Civil War that went on from 1861 to 1865, a very critical period in American history. But after that moment, the United States had its eyes on overseas assets. The first one was Hawaii, in which Pearl Harbor was built into a naval base by the U.S. So Pearl Harbor is a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. And Hawaii was important because it was an important, we might call it a midway point between Asia, right? So here's Asia, here's Hawaii, and here's the US, right? And of course, in those days, the ships that sailed from the US to Asia would have to be refueled. And so Hawaii served as a very vital refueling point for any cargo going between the United States and Asia. So the United States built Pearl Harbor, and so it had a naval base to operate out of. Naval and commerce. With commerce comes the necessity to protect. However, when the United States went to war in 1898, Hawaii was officially annexed. So in 1898, the U.S. annexed Hawaii. Annex means to add it, right? Add territory. It was only later on, I think in the 1950s, it actually became a state, but it remained a possession, a formal possession of the United States in 1898. Meanwhile, in the Philippines was a little bit different. It was controlled, or it was ruled by Spain, right? Ruled by Spain. And a leading nationalist figure in the Philippines was Emilio Aguinaldo. So we'll call him a Philippine nationalist. And he wanted to break free from Spanish rule. Again, like most nationalists wanting sovereignty, that is the right to rule yourself. In other words, coming from a nationalist approach, he wanted all Filipino people to be ruled by other Filipino people, not Spanish people. And this was something that was similarly happening not just in the Philippines, but the Spanish possession of Cuba. There were various revolts in Cuba as well. The United States initially came into their conflict with Spain, right? The Spanish-American War in 1898 is a war between Spain and America. That should be, sort of evident from that. But one of the things that got the U.S. involved was what was going on in Cuba. And that was the fact that there was a native Cuban population wanting to break free from Spanish rule. At the same time, the United States also had a lot of economic connections in Cuba. And this war started when the USS Maine, which was a U.S. battleship, I don't know if it was technically a battleship, but it was some sort of naval vessel, U.S. battleship exploded in Cuba. And as a result, the US blamed Spain. In other words, the Spanish blew up a battleship that belonged to the Americans, and as a result, the United States declared war on Spain. So we might call this the reason for US declaration of war. All right, reason for the US declaration of war. And just like that, the Spanish-American War started. Now, the war itself was a victory for the United States, a pretty harsh victory, pretty quick victory. Not harsh victory. It was a quick victory. In fact, in the United States, this was referred to as the Splendid Little War because it was a war that was over very quickly. It was a war that the United States decisively won, and it was a war in which not very many Americans died in. So this was a great war from the perspective of the United States. And one of the reasons that it was made splendid was not just what happened with Cuba, which did gain its independence, right? Became an independent nation. But the United States took that opportunity to invade the Philippines, which was also a Spanish territory. And so in Manila, right? Manila is the capital city. The US occupied it. Now, with defeating the Spanish, having Cuba liberated, the United States now had a choice to make, and that was what to do with the Philippines. Should they listen to Aguinaldo and allow the Philippines to become an independent country? That was one option. But the United States opted not to do that, and some of the reasons had to do with other imperial powers at the time. Both Japan and Germany had recently taken over possessions in the Pacific. The Japanese had taken over Taiwan, not to mention had already taken over Korea. Well, at this point, not yet Korea, so no, I'll cross it out. The Japanese had taken over Taiwan, and the Germans had taken over New Guinea. And so the fear was for the United States that if left independent, one of these other aggressive imperial powers would take it over. The Japanese would take it, the Germans would take it, maybe the British would take it, maybe the French would take it. And so for this reason, the United States formally annexed and added the Philippines. This led to the Philippine insurrection. This was the war in which Emilio Aguinaldo and his followers fought against American rule. Instead of wanting to free the Philippines from Spanish rule, it now became a matter of freeing it after the Spanish-American War from American rule. The Philippine insurrection was very bloody, a lot more bloody than the Spanish-American War. So we'll call this the War to Liberate Philippines from U.S. rule, right? The U.S. eventually won, but in 1916 made the promise of independence. In other words, the United States used the Philippines as a gateway into China. It was a really good staging off point. Again, if you think of the Philippines being located right in this area here, again, this is the Philippines right here. It was a perfect staging off point to get into Chinese trade. But the United States promised independence in 1916. My handwriting is getting very sloppy. I apologize. And in 1946, we'll talk about later, is when the Philippines achieved independence.